September 12, 1943, 2:17 a.m. South Pacific. 120 miles east of Bougainville Island, the night sea looked calm. Too calm. Under a cloudless sky, the moon painted Pacific with a pale silver glow. Waves rolled slowly across the black water, breaking gently against the steel hulls of 8 Japanese battleships anchored in loose formation, massive silhouettes, floating fortresses. Each vessel carried thousands of tons of armor plating, heavy anti-aircraft guns, and batteries capable of leveling entire coastal cities. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, these ships represented dominance in the Pacific, but far beyond the horizon, something small, fragile, and completely underestimated was already on its way. At just 5,000 feet above the dark ocean, a twin-engine aircraft droned quietly through the night sky. Its engines were not powerful. Its speed was unimpressive. Its wings were straight, wide, and oddly shaped. To most aviation experts of time, the aircraft was a joke, slow, vulnerable, and carrying a weapon that many naval engineers had already dismissed as completely impractical. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Edward Ned Harwood leaned forward over the instrument panel. The dim red glow of cockpit lights reflected in the glass of his goggles. His left hand rested lightly on the throttle. His right hand held the control yoke steady as the aircraft cut through thin, high-altitude winds. Behind him, the navigation officer studied a map illuminated by a small lamp. The target lay just ahead, and beneath the belly of their aircraft hung the weapon everyone said would never work, a glider torpedo, a torpedo designed to fly. Naval engineers had laughed when the concept was first proposed. Traditional torpedoes were heavy underwater weapons. They were meant to be dropped close to ships, often within a mile, giving enemy gunners plenty of time to fire back. Aircraft delivering torpedoes suffered horrific losses during early Pacific battles. Too slow, too exposed, too easy to shoot down. So when a small group of American engineers suggested attaching wings to a torpedo so it could glide silently towards ships from miles away, many experts called the idea absurd. The device looked strange, almost ridiculous. A standard Mark 13 naval torpedo, but modified with detachable wooden wings and a small tail stabilizer. The idea was simple. Instead of dropping the torpedo directly into the water near the target, aircraft would release it from altitude. The wings would allow the weapon to glide silently across the air for miles. Only seconds before impact, the wings would detach. Then the torpedo would strike the ocean, already aimed directly at its prey. It would continue underwater, exactly like a normal torpedo, in theory, but in practice, most naval commanders believed it was a waste of time. Too complicated, too fragile, too unpredictable. Yet tonight, in the darkness above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Harwood was about to prove them wrong. The aircraft he flew was not glamorous. It was not fast like a fighter, nor heavily armored like a bomber. But it had one crucial advantage: range. The aircraft was the Grumman TBF Avenger, one of the most versatile naval aircraft of the war. Powered by a single Wright-R 2600 twin cyclone radial engine, the Avenger could fly more than 1,000 miles without refueling. Its large internal bomb bay allowed it to carry a single torpedo or heavy bomb payload. But tonight's mission carried something experimental, something the Japanese had never seen before. Harwood glanced at the altimeter. 5,000 feet. Exactly as planned. Range, he asked. Behind him, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz checked the navigation plot. 20 miles, Ortiz replied quietly. Harwood nodded. Below them, the ocean remained silent and empty. But somewhere ahead, 8 of the most powerful warships in the Pacific waited, completely unaware. Far below the Avenger, the experimental glider torpedo rested securely in the aircraft's bomb bay cradle. Its wooden wings extended out like a miniature aircraft. They had been designed carefully to support the torpedo's heavy 2,200-pound body during the glide phase. When released, gravity and aerodynamic lift would do the rest. If everything worked, that if still haunted many engineers. Early test drops had produced mixed results. Sometimes the torpedo glided perfectly. Sometimes it veered wildly off course. And sometimes the wings snapped off midair. But recent improvements had changed everything. New stabilizers, better wing mounting brackets, more precise release mechanisms. Tonight would be the weapon's first real combat test, and no one outside a small group of naval engineers even knew it existed. Ortiz leaned forward slightly. 15 miles. Harwood lowered the aircraft slowly. Altitude dropped to 3,000 feet. The Avenger's engine growled softly as the plane descended through thin layers of cool ocean air. Speed, 145 miles per hour. Perfect release conditions. Harwood looked out across the moonlit horizon, and then he saw them. At first, they looked like dark islands, massive shapes breaking the silver reflection of the sea. 8 battleships, anchored, still, unmoving. Even from miles away, their sheer size was unmistakable. Each vessel stretched more than 700 feet long, armored hulls thicker than most coastal fortifications, gun turrets capable of launching shells the size of small cars. But armor meant nothing to a torpedo, especially one arriving without warning. Target confirmed. Ortiz whispered. Harwood adjusted heading slightly. The Avenger lined up along a perfect attack vector. 10 miles. At this distance, traditional torpedo aircraft would still be far outside engagement range. But that was the entire point. The glider torpedo would do the rest. Harwood's finger hovered near the bomb release switch. The aircraft continued its silent approach. 9 miles. 8 miles. Still no searchlights. No radar alarms. No anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese fleet remained completely unaware. Harwood breathed slowly. Years of naval aviation had taught him patience. This moment would decide whether the strange experimental weapon beneath his aircraft would be remembered as genius or one of the most foolish ideas of the war. 7 miles. He leveled the aircraft. Prepare release, Harwood said calmly. Ortiz reached toward the arming switch. The torpedo stabilizers locked into position. Wings ready. Guidance gyroscope spinning. 6 miles. Below them, the giant battleships remained motionless in the moonlight. Harwood centered the crosshair sight over the middle of the formation. One precise release could send the gliding weapon straight toward the heart of the fleet. 5 miles. His thumb pressed the safety guard open. For miles, the Avenger hummed steadily through the night. 3 miles. The moment had arrived. Harwood flipped the switch. The bomb bay door snapped open. Cold wind rushed into the fuselage. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the strange winged torpedo dropped free from the aircraft and began to glide silently toward the unsuspecting fleet below. No engine noise. No splash. Just a silent shadow drifting across the moonlit Pacific. And in less than 60 seconds, the most mocked weapon idea of the entire war would begin sinking battleships. The winged torpedo glided silently through the night air. From 3,000 feet above the Pacific, gravity pulled the weapon downward while its wooden wings sliced through the cool ocean wind. There was no engine, no exhaust, no sound beyond the faint whisper of air sliding across its frame. To anyone standing on the decks of the Japanese battleship below, the sky remained empty, but inside the aircraft that had released it, Lieutenant Commander Edward Harwood watched the weapon's trajectory with intense focus. He had exactly one chance to see whether years of engineering theory would actually work in real combat. Behind him, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz leaned toward the observation window. Even in the dim moonlight, the glider torpedo was barely visible, just a dark shape descending toward the ocean. "How's it flying?" Ortiz asked. Harwood kept his eyes fixed on the sighting scope. "Stable," he replied. But stability had always been the biggest challenge. When naval engineers first introduced the concept of an aerial gliding torpedo in early 1943, the design had immediately raised serious concerns. Traditional torpedoes were extremely heavy. A standard Mark 13 torpedo weighed more than 2,200 pounds and measured over 13 feet long. It carried a 600-pound Torpex warhead, powerful enough to tear open the armor hull of a battleship below the waterline. But torpedoes were built for water, not air. Dropping them from high altitude was normally impossible. If released too fast or from too great a height, the torpedo could smash itself apart when striking the ocean surface. For years, American torpedo bombers have been forced to fly dangerously low and slow during attack runs. Typical torpedo releases occurred at just 50 to 100 feet above the water, often less than 800 yards from the target ship. At that range, aircraft became perfect targets for anti-aircraft guns. Japanese gunners had learned this quickly. During early Pacific battles, entire squadrons of American torpedo bombers had been wiped out before their weapons even touched the water. One aircraft in particular had suffered catastrophic losses. The Douglas TBD Devastator had entered the war as a U.S. Navy's primary torpedo attack aircraft. But by 1942, it had become painfully obsolete, slow, lightly armored, and forced to fly directly into enemy gunfire during torpedo runs. During the Battle of Midway, entire Devastator squadrons had been slaughtered while attempting to reach Japanese carriers. Out of 41 aircraft that launched torpedo attacks during the battle, only 6 returned. The devastating losses forced naval engineers to rethink everything about aerial torpedo warfare. The result was a Grumman TBF Avenger, the aircraft Harwood now piloted across the Pacific night sky. Compared to the Devastator, the Avenger was a massive improvement. The aircraft was powered by a 1,900 horsepower Radar 2600 twin Cyclone radial engine, giving it far more speed and climbing power than its predecessor. Its maximum speed reached nearly 275 miles per hour, significantly faster than earlier torpedo bombers. The Avenger also carried heavier defensive armament, a powered dorsal turret-mounted .50 caliber machine gun, capable of rotating almost 360 degrees to engage enemy fighters. Another .30 caliber gun protected the aircraft's underside. For the first time, American torpedo bombers could defend themselves while approaching enemy fleets. The Avenger's internal bomb bay also solved another problem. Instead of hanging torpedoes externally under the fuselage, which created drag and reduced speed, the weapon could now be carried inside the aircraft. This allowed the bomber to fly faster and farther while protecting the torpedo from damage. But despite these improvements, the biggest problem remained: distance. Even the Avenger still had to fly directly into the teeth of enemy defenses when releasing a torpedo. Anti-aircraft guns on Japanese warships were deadly accurate. Many battleships carried dozens of automatic cannons capable of filling the sky with exploding shells. Approaching within 1,000 yards often meant flying through a wall of steel. That was exactly why the glider torpedo concept had been created. If the torpedo could be launched from miles away, the aircraft would never need to enter the danger zone. The idea itself had come from an unlikely source: a small team of naval engineers studying German glide bomb experiments. The Germans had already demonstrated the effectiveness of aerial glide weapons against Allied ships in the Mediterranean. Weapons like the Fritz X had destroyed heavily armored vessels using precision guidance systems. But the American design followed a different philosophy. Instead of creating an expensive guided weapon, engineers aimed for something simpler: a mechanical glider, cheap, disposable, and terrifyingly silent. The design consisted of 3 main components. First, the torpedo itself, a standard Mark 13 naval weapon with its explosive warhead and underwater propulsion system. Second, a detachable wing assembly. 2 lightweight wooden wings extended outward from the torpedo's body, providing enough lift for a controlled glide. Finally, a stabilizing tail fin mounted at the rear. This fin kept the torpedo pointed toward its target during descent. Once the weapon reached the ocean surface, a simple mechanical trigger would release the wings. The torpedo would enter the water nose first, exactly like a standard drop. Then its internal engine would ignite. Compressed air would drive its propellers, pushing the weapon underwater at nearly 33 knots. At that point, it became indistinguishable from any other torpedo. But the real advantage came from the launch distance. Tests suggested the glider torpedo could travel up to 4 miles through the air before striking the ocean. For miles, far outside the reach of most shipboard anti-aircraft weapons. In theory, aircraft could attack fleets without ever being detected. The weapon would simply appear from nowhere. Yet even after successful test flights, many senior naval officers remained skeptical. The wings looked fragile. The glide path seemed unpredictable. and combat conditions were far more chaotic than test ranges. Some engineers privately worried that crosswinds or turbulence could send the torpedo drifting off course. Others feared the wings might detach too early, or worse, fail to detach at all. But tonight's mission would answer every one of those doubts. Back in the cockpit, Harwood followed the weapon's descent through the sight window. The torpedo had already glided more than a mile. Its wings remained perfectly stable. "Still tracking straight," he said. Ortiz looked down toward the Japanese formation again. The massive ships still sat quietly on the water. No alarms, no movement. They had absolutely no idea what was approaching. 2 miles. The torpedo continued gliding. Wind currents pushed gently against its wooden wings, but the stabilizer fin held its course. Below, the dark hulls of the battleships grew larger. Harwood could now clearly see the largest vessel near the center of the formation, a giant battleship with 4 main gun turrets and towering superstructure. Perfect target. 1 mile, Ortiz whispered. Harwood's heart pounded harder now. The weapon had already exceeded expectations. If the wings detached correctly, and if the torpedo entered the water at the correct angle, the first real glider torpedo attack in history would strike within seconds. The silent weapon dropped lower, 500 feet above the ocean, 400, 300, then something changed. Inside the Avenger's cockpit, a small radar receiver suddenly crackled with sharp static bursts. Harwood frowned. "That's new," he muttered. Ortiz leaned toward the radio panel. More signals appeared. Strong signals, coming from the fleet below. "Radar just activated," Ortiz said quietly. Down on the Japanese battleships, technicians had just noticed something strange on their detection screens. A small object falling from the sky, and seconds later, the entire fleet would erupt into alarms. 3:21 a.m. For several long seconds, the Japanese fleet had slept peacefully under the pale Pacific moon. Then a radar operator aboard the lead battleship froze. A faint echo had appeared on the screen. Small, unusual, descending. At first, the technician thought it might be interference. Radar at sea often produced strange signals, waves, atmospheric reflections, even flocks of birds. But this contact behaved differently. The blip moved steadily downward, and it was approaching fast. "Contact bearing 085, the operator called out, his voice suddenly tense, altitude decreasing. Across the operations room, officers leaned toward the glowing radar display. The object was tiny, far smaller than any aircraft, yet its trajectory was unmistakable, straight toward the fleet. "Possible bomb," one officer muttered. That word alone triggered immediate concern. Within seconds, alarms echoed across the steel corridors of the battleship. On the upper decks, sailors snapped awake from their night watch fatigue. Searchlights swung toward the sky. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their positions. But when they looked upward, they saw nothing. No bomber, no engine sound, no formation of aircraft, just a silent night sky. 500 feet above the water, the glider torpedo continued its descent. Inside the cockpit of the Grumman TBF Avenger, Lieutenant Commander Edward Harwood felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. "Radar picked us up," Ortiz said quietly behind him. Harwood nodded. Too late. The weapon had already traveled nearly its full glide distance. Even if the Japanese realized what was happening now, there was nothing they could do. The torpedo had entered its final descent phase. Below them, the largest ship in the formation loomed directly beneath the weapon's path. A monstrous battleship, more than 700 feet long. Massive gun turrets pointing silently toward the horizon. But even the thickest battleship armor could not stop a torpedo strike beneath the waterline. 300 feet, 200 on the weapon itself. A small mechanical timer triggered the next stage. With a sudden metallic snap, the wooden wings detached. For a brief moment, the torpedo plunged freely through the air. Then its steel nose struck the ocean surface. Splash. The impact was violent but perfectly controlled. Instead of shattering, the weapon slipped cleanly into the water at shallow angle. The torpedo's internal engine ignited instantly, Compressed air roared through its propulsion system. Twin propellers spun to life. Now fully submerged, the Mark 13 torpedo accelerated beneath the waves. Speed, 33 knots. Course, directly toward the center of the Japanese formation. Back aboard the battleship, lookouts finally spotted something. A ripple, a faint line slicing across the moonlit water. Torpedo wake! The warning shout exploded across the deck. Suddenly, the calm night shattered into chaos. Hard to port. Sirens screamed. Crew members sprinted across the deck. But the enormous battleship could not turn quickly, even at full rudder. Ships of that size required hundreds of yards to change direction, and the torpedo was already less than 500 yards away. In the Avenger above, Harwood leaned forward toward the observation window. He could see the wake clearly now, a thin white line racing across the ocean surface, straight toward the massive hull. Impact in 10 seconds, he whispered. Ortiz stared downward. The torpedo sliced closer. 300 yards. 200. Below, the Japanese battleship's engines roared as the crew desperately attempted to maneuver, but physics had already sealed their fate. The torpedo struck. A blinding flash erupted beneath the waterline. For a split second, the entire side of the battleship seemed to bulge outward. Then came the explosion. A thunderous detonation ripped through the hull as the 600-pound Torpex warhead detonated beneath the armored plating. Water erupted skyward in a towering column. The ship's hull shuddered violently. Steel plates bent inward like crushed tin. Inside the vessel, shock waves blasted through corridors and engine rooms. Lights flickered. Bulkheads buckled. Men were thrown violently against walls. Above deck, sailors were knocked flat by the blast. For a moment, stunned silence filled the air. Then the ship began to list, slowly at first, then more dramatically. Inside the Avenger, Ortiz exhaled sharply. Direct hit. Harwood didn't celebrate. Not yet. He scanned the fleet below. The explosion had awakened the entire formation. Searchlights cut across the sky. Signal lamps flashed between ships. And now the Japanese radar operators were scanning desperately for the attacking aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons upward, but Harwood's Avenger remained more than 4 miles away, far outside effective gun range. That was the genius of the glider torpedo. The fleet had been struck, without ever seeing the attacker. Below them, damage reports were already spreading across the Japanese formation. The torpedo had torn a massive hole below the battleship's armor belt. Seawater flooded rapidly into the lower compartments. Damage control crews rushed to seal bulkheads. Pumps roared to life. But the flooding continued. The ship's list increased to 5 degrees. Then 7. Meanwhile, across the formation, other ships were scrambling. Searchlights scanned the sky, but there were no bombers diving toward them. No torpedo planes racing low over the water. Only darkness. Harwood turned the Avenger slightly, circling at high altitude. He wanted confirmation. Down below, the wounded battleship situation worsened rapidly. Internal flooding had reached the engine compartments. Without propulsion, the ship could not maneuver. And worse still, the massive warship was now an easy target, because the glider torpedo attack had never been designed to involve just one weapon. Harwood glanced down at the weapon panel, beside a seat, 3 empty release indicators. But one remained armed. Another glider torpedo still hung beneath the aircraft. Behind him, Ortiz realized the same thing. "You're going back in?" Harwood nodded slowly. "The fleet's awake now," Ortiz warned. Searchlights continued sweeping across the sky below. Radar operators were scanning frantically, but they still didn't know exactly where the attack had come from. Harwood pushed the Avenger into a wide climbing turn. Altitude increased again. For 1,000 feet, the aircraft moved quietly through the darkness beyond the reach of the fleet's searchlights. Then Harwood banked again, lining up for another attack run. Below them, the first battleship continued listing heavily as damage control crews fought to contain the flooding. But the worst part for the Japanese fleet was only beginning, because somewhere in the darkness beyond their searchlights, more American aircraft were approaching. each carrying the same strange experimental weapon, the same weapon experts had once mocked as impossible. And within the next 20 minutes, 8 battleships would discover just how wrong those experts had been. 3:28 a.m. 7 minutes after the first explosion, the calm waters east of Bougainville had transformed into a battlefield. Sirens screamed across the Japanese formation. Searchlights cut through the sky like giant white spears, sweeping across the clouds in frantic arcs. Anti-aircraft crews loaded ammunition belts and swung their guns upward, scanning for enemy bombers. But the sky remained empty. No dive bombers. No torpedo planes roaring low across the water. Just the echo of a single devastating explosion still rippling across the fleet. The first battleship was already in serious trouble. Flood water rushed through torn bulkheads below the waterline where the Mark 13 torpedo had detonated. Damage control teams worked frantically. Steel doors slammed shut. Pumps roared to life. But the list continued to increase. 9 degrees, then 10. The giant warship had effectively become a wounded animal floating in the center of the formation, and wounded animals attract predators. Far above the fleet, Lieutenant Commander Edward Harwood leveled his aircraft at 4,000 feet. The engine of the Grumman TBF Avenger hummed steadily as the aircraft slipped through thin high-altitude winds. Inside the cockpit, the dim red instrument lights cast long shadows across the metal panels. Behind him, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz studied the fleet through binoculars. "They're wide awake now," Ortiz said quietly. Harwood nodded. Of course they were. But awareness did not equal understanding. The Japanese still believed they were under attack by conventional aircraft. They expected torpedo bombers approaching low over the water, so their searchlights focused on the horizon. Their anti-aircraft guns were aimed at the lower sky. They were looking in the wrong direction. No one was watching the high-altitude darkness where the real threat drifted silently above them. Harwood adjusted his heading slightly. The Avenger rolled gently into position. Below them, the formation of 8 battleships had begun maneuvering. Huge propellers churned the water as the vessels attempted to spread out. If the ships separated too far, future torpedo attacks would become much more difficult. Harwood needed to act fast. "Distance?" he asked. Ortiz glanced at the navigation scale. 4.5 miles. Perfect. That was well within the glider torpedo's effective glide range. But there was something else now. Ortiz lowered the binoculars slowly. "You see that?" he said. Harwood looked again toward the fleet. Near the outer edge of the formation, several smaller escort ships had begun accelerating. Destroyers. Fast, agile, and equipped with powerful anti-aircraft batteries. One destroyer in particular had already changed course directly toward the direction of the previous explosion. Harwood knew what that meant. They were searching, trying to locate the attacking aircraft. Even worse, several of the battleships had begun activating their own radar arrays. The glowing antennas rotated slowly atop their command towers. Sooner or later, those systems might detect the Avenger. "Let's make this quick," Harwood said calmly. He eased the aircraft downward again. Altitude dropped to 3,000 feet. Speed reduced slightly. The second glider torpedo waited beneath the aircraft's belly. Another strange winged weapon ready for its first real battlefield test. Below them, the wounded battleship was now clearly visible. The vessel had developed a heavy list toward its damaged side. Deck guns pointed uselessly toward the sky. Smoke drifted slowly from ventilation shafts as internal fires began spreading through flooded compartments. But Harwood ignored the crippled ship. A damaged target was already neutralized. Instead, he focused on the largest vessel still moving at the center of the formation, another battleship, even bigger. Its massive silhouette dominated the fleet. For enormous main gun turrets, heavy armor, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns along the deck. It was the most valuable target in the entire formation. "Target locked," Harwood said. Ortiz reached toward the weapon control panel. The arming switches clicked into place. Below the aircraft, the second glider torpedo's stabilizing fins locked firmly into position. Gyroscopic guidance system spinning. Release mechanism primed. 3 miles. The Avenger cut quietly through the moonlit sky. Searchlights continued sweeping the horizon. None pointed upward, 2.5 miles. Below, one of the Japanese destroyers suddenly altered course again. This time, it accelerated directly toward the Avenger's approximate position. Ortiz frowned. That destroyer's getting closer. Harwood didn't react. Even if the ship guessed their direction, its guns couldn't reach them at this altitude and distance. And by the time they got close enough, the weapon would already be gone. 2 miles. The battleship below filled the targeting site now. Its massive armored hull gleamed faintly under the moonlight. One precise hit beneath the waterline could cripple it instantly. Harwood steadied the aircraft. 1 mile to release point. Ortiz tightened his grip on the console. Anti-aircraft gunners below were firing now, but the shells exploded far below the Avenger. The Japanese crews were still guessing, still searching blindly through the darkness. Harwood lowered the nose slightly. The crosshair sight aligned perfectly with the ship's centerline. Ready? 1/2 mile. He flipped the bomb bay switch. The metal doors beneath the Avenger snapped open once again. Cold air rushed violently into the aircraft. For a brief moment, the second glider torpedo hung, suspended beneath the fuselage. Then gravity took hold. The weapon dropped. Its wooden wings caught the air immediately. Instead of plunging downward, the torpedo stabilized into a smooth glide. Once again, the strange silent weapon began drifting toward the fleet, for miles away from the nearest gun, completely unstoppable. Inside the Avenger, Harwood watched its path carefully. The glide angle looked perfect. Wind conditions steady. Below them, the destroyer that had been approaching suddenly fired a flare into sky. The bright white light exploded overhead, illuminating a large section of the ocean. For a moment, the entire fleet became visible. Searchlights immediately shifted toward the illuminated area. And in that sudden brightness, one of the Japanese lookouts spotted something impossible. A torpedo, floating through the air. His voice erupted across the deck. Torpedo in the sky. But it was already too late. The weapon continued gliding silently toward the battleship. 500 feet. 400. Then, snap, the wings detached. The torpedo plunged into the ocean. Seconds later, its engine roared to life beneath the waves. The white wake raced forward like a spear, straight toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. And this time, every sailor watching the water knew exactly what was coming. 3:31 a.m. The torpedo wake sliced across the moonlit water like a white-hot blade. This time, the Japanese fleet saw it clearly. A thin, foaming trail racing straight toward the center battleship. Torpedo starboard side. The warning cry echoed across the massive vessel's deck. Sirens howled. Signal lamps flashed frantically between ships. Hard to port. Full rudder. Deep within the ship's armored hull, engine crews slammed the throttles forward. The battleship's propellers churned violently, throwing spirals of white foam behind the stern. But physics was merciless. Battleships weighing over 35,000 tons could not pivot quickly. Even at full power, turning such a giant required hundreds of meters of ocean. And the torpedo was already less than 300 yards away. Inside the cockpit of the Grumman TBF Avenger, Lieutenant Commander Edward Harwood watched the moment unfold through the sighting scope. Impact in 8 seconds, he said quietly. Behind him, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz tracked the wake through binoculars. 7, 6. The battleship's rudder fought the ocean, but the ship had started its turn far too late. 3-2. The torpedo struck beneath the armored belt. The detonation was monstrous. A column of water blasted skyward as the Mark 13 torpedo exploded directly beneath the ship's starboard side. The shock wave slammed through the battleship's hull like a hammer. Steel plates buckled. Rivets snapped. Inside the vessel, engine rooms erupted into chaos. Steam pipes burst violently. Generators exploded. Men were thrown across compartments as the blast wave tore through internal bulkheads. Above deck, sailors clung desperately to railings as the ship lurched violently to one side. Within seconds, the giant battleship developed a heavy list. Water surged through the torn hull. The second ship had been crippled, but the nightmare for the Japanese fleet was only beginning. because by now, the sky above them was no longer empty. High above the formation, dark silhouettes moved through the clouds. One aircraft had become 3, then 5, then 8. An entire squadron of Avengers had arrived. Each aircraft carried the same strange experimental weapon. The glider torpedo many naval officers had once mocked as impossible. Inside the lead aircraft of the approaching formation, Commander Richard Mallory studied the chaos below. The first 2 explosions had illuminated the fleet like distant lightning. Mallory smiled grimly. "So, Harwood was right," he muttered. Behind him, his navigator replied quietly, "They never saw it coming." The squadron commander pushed his throttle forward slightly. The radial engine roared as the Avenger climbed to 4,500 feet. Perfect glide altitude. Below them, Japanese searchlights now scanned the sky frantically, but they were still searching the lower altitudes where torpedo bombers normally attacked. None of the beams reached the high, dark ceiling where the Avengers now circled. Mallory spoke calmly into the radio. "All aircraft, prepare release sequence." 8 bomb bay doors opened almost simultaneously. 8 winged torpedoes waited beneath the aircraft, a new kind of naval weapon, silent, invisible, and deadly. Back below, the Japanese fleet struggled desperately to react. Destroyers raced outward from the formation, trying to locate the attackers. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the darkness, but the real threat was already descending. Mallory reached the release point first. Release! The first weapon dropped. Then another. Then another. 8 glider torpedoes slipped free from the aircraft and spread across the night sky. For several seconds, they simply glided, silent shapes drifting toward the fleet from miles away. Below, Japanese radar operators stared in confusion as multiple descending contacts appeared simultaneously on their screens. "Too many, too fast. Multiple aerial objects," one operator shouted. "What are they?" an officer demanded. But there was no time left to answer. The weapons had already begun their final descent. One after another, snap, snap, snap. The wings detached. 8 torpedoes plunged into the ocean surface. Then their engines ignited. 8 white wakes tore across the water in different directions. The entire fleet was suddenly surrounded by incoming torpedoes. Torpedoes everywhere. Panic exploded across the decks of the battleships. Helmsmen spun their wheels desperately, but there were simply too many. One torpedo slammed into the port side of the 3rd battleship. The explosion lifted part of the vessel completely out of the water. Another struck a 4th ship near the stern. Its rudder assembly disintegrated instantly, leaving the giant vessel unable to steer. A 5th torpedo detonated beneath the battleship's forward magazines. The blast triggered a chain reaction inside the ship. For a brief moment, the entire bow section erupted in flame as ammunition storage compartments exploded. 2 destroyers attempted evasive maneuvers, but even their speed could not save them. A glider torpedo struck one amidships, tearing the smaller vessel nearly in half. Across the battlefield, explosions echoed like rolling thunder. Columns of water and fire rose into the air as one ship after another suffered catastrophic damage. Inside the lead Avenger, Mallory stared down at the inferno below. "Good God!" His navigator shook his head slowly. They never had a chance. Within less than 10 minutes, the Japanese formation had been transformed into chaos. 8 major warships were burning or flooding. Some were already dead in the water. Others struggled desperately to remain afloat. The silent glider torpedo, the weapon many experts had once called ridiculous, had just crippled an entire battleship force without a single American aircraft entering gun range. But the most shocking moment was still coming, because one of the torpedoes had struck something far more dangerous than armor plating. It had detonated directly beneath the ammunition magazines of the largest battleship in the fleet, and within seconds, the entire ship began to explode. 3:34 a.m. For a moment, the ocean held its breath. The torpedo had struck directly beneath the forward magazines of the largest battleship in the formation. Deep inside the armored belly of the ship, thousands of pounds of naval shells and propellant charges were stored in reinforced compartments designed to survive almost anything. Almost. But torpedoes attacked where battleships were weakest, below the armor belt, beneath the waterline, where protection was thin and vulnerable. The explosion from the Mark 13 torpedo tore open a hull like a giant claw. Seawater surged violently into the forward compartments. Within seconds, the flooding reached the ship's primary ammunition storage rooms. Inside those magazines were hundreds of massive shells for the battleship's main guns. Each shell weighed more than a small automobile, each stored beside volatile propellant charges. And now, seawater, sparks, and pressure were colliding inside the steel chambers. For a brief moment, the ship seemed to freeze in time. Then the first internal explosion erupted. A deep, muffled blast echoed through the hull. Crew members inside the lower decks barely had time to react. A second explosion followed instantly, louder, more violent. Then the entire front section of the battleship vanished in a blinding white flash. The magazine detonated. A colossal fireball erupted from the ship's bow, tearing through gun turrets, command towers, and radar antennas. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted thousands of tons of steel out of the ocean. Observers miles away later described the blast as a rising pillar of flame that briefly turned night into day. Inside the cockpit of the Grumman TBF Avenger, Commander Richard Mallory instinctively pulled his aircraft upward. Even from nearly 5 miles away, the shock wave rippled through the air. "My God!" Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz whispered from the rear observation seat. Below them, the battleship was gone. Where the massive warship had floated moments before, there was now only a raging inferno surrounded by scattered debris. Burning oil spread across the ocean surface. Fragments of twisted steel rained back into the water. The largest ship in the fleet had been destroyed in less than a minute. But the devastation did not end there. Across the formation, the remaining battleships struggled to survive. One vessel had taken 2 torpedo hits along its port side. Its engines had already failed. Without propulsion, the giant ship drifted helplessly while flooding slowly consumed its lower decks. Another battleship burned from stern to bow after secondary ammunition detonations spread through the gun turrets. A third vessel had rolled dangerously to starboard, its deck now tilted at more than 20 degrees. Damage control teams fought desperately to counterflood compartments in an attempt to stabilize the ship, but the damage was catastrophic. 8 major warships had been struck within minutes. The entire formation had been shattered by weapons that had arrived silently from miles away, and not a single attacking aircraft had been shot down. High above the battlefield, the American Avengers began turning away from the burning fleet. Their mission was complete. Mallory looked back over his shoulder through the cockpit glass. The horizon behind them glowed orange from multiple fires spreading across the ocean. He exhaled slowly. "Signal the fleet," he said. "Mission successful." Within hours, reconnaissance aircraft would confirm the unimaginable results. 1 battleship completely destroyed by a magazine explosion. 3 battleships sinking beyond recovery. 2 more crippled beyond operational use. 2 additional ships severely damaged. 8 battleships struck by torpedoes delivered from aircraft that never entered defensive gun range. The experimental glider torpedo had performed far beyond expectations. Back in Washington, many naval experts struggled to believe the reports. Just months earlier, the concept had been dismissed as unrealistic. The idea of attaching wings to a torpedo had sounded like something from an engineering fantasy. Too fragile, too unpredictable, too strange. Yet on that September night in 1943, the weapon had rewritten the rules of naval combat. Aircraft no longer needed to fly directly into walls of anti-aircraft fire. They could now strike fleets from miles away. Silently, without warning, naval tacticians quickly understood the implications. Battleships, once considered nearly invincible floating fortresses, were suddenly vulnerable to invisible aerial attacks. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Radar detection might come too late, and armor plating could not stop weapons that struck beneath the waterline. For Lieutenant Commander Edward Harwood, the man who had first tested the weapon in combat that night, the mission became a defining moment of his career. His calm decision to release the first glider torpedo had triggered one of the most devastating naval attacks of the Pacific War. In later years, engineers have refined the concept even further. Guided glide bombs, rocket-assisted torpedoes, long-range anti-ship missiles. All would follow the same fundamental idea demonstrated that night over Pacific. Strike from beyond the enemy's reach. Disappear before they can respond. But it all began with a strange wooden-winged torpedo that many experts once called ridiculous. A weapon that looked fragile, improvised, almost absurd. Yet in the darkness above Bougainville Island, that stupid idea sank battleships without warning and changed naval warfare forever. And as the last American Avengers disappeared into the dawn sky, the burning wreckage of an entire fleet drifted silently across the Pacific. A reminder that in war, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones no one believes in.